Today, at the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh, Queen Elizabeth II lies at rest. This afternoon, the coffin will be marched in procession to St Giles's Cathedral for a service of remembrance, accompanied by the new King, Charles III, and other members of the royal family. Tomorrow, Tuesday the 13th of September 2022, the late Queen will be flown to Buckingham Palace in London before another procession to the 900-year-old Westminster Hall, where she will lie in state until next Monday. The Queen's funeral will then take place, finishing with a service at Westminster Abbey at 11 a.m. I was very keen to establish my Britishness in episode 1 of the history of the Sportster, and I'm glad I made that effort. The events of the last few days have really emphasised the very essence of Britishness, the history, the pomp and ceremony, the unity and national pride, and of course that most British of all institutions, the monarchy. To many, the very idea of a hereditary monarchy is bizarre, and to others is actually offensive. Why should someone be elevated to the level of monarch just because their parents were royal? The system is quite ridiculous, really. However, as that great philanthropist and theologian Jeremy Clarkson noted in the Sunday Times yesterday, if we were allowed to choose our monarch, there'd be endless, lurid media nonsense, obscene amounts of money would be spent, and in the end we'd wind up with King Alan Sugar. No, hereditary royalty is a poor solution, but as Winston Churchill said about democracy itself, while it is the worst form of government there is, it's still better than all the others. And the hereditary monarchy lies at the very core of what it means to be British. God save the King. I mention all this because in episode 1, in addition to affirming my British patriotism, we saw how building and selling motorcycles fitted into world history and especially into British history after World War II. We noted the bitter truth that, for most British subjects, and in Greater Europe too, such frivolous luxuries like motorbikes were far beyond their means. Poverty in Britain was crippling. Even in 1960, 14% of the population was said to be living in genuine poverty, about 7 million people. This meant that even in the 1970s, many of these people were forced to live in miserably cold, dark and unsanitary dwellings, perhaps that had been badly damaged during wartime bombing. Still, Britain and Europe continue to struggle to recover from the destructive horrors of the Second World War even decades later. For ordinary people, the fight for survival during peacetime was every bit as hard as it had been during the war. But there were two events which impacted Britain and its greatness more than any others in the post-war years. The first of these was rationing. In 1950, rationing on some preserved food and then petrol was relaxed. On the 4th of July 1954, all rationing was finally ended. Changes appeared almost overnight as previously empty shops suddenly had stock to sell. The extra demand, together with other economic improvements, meant that jobs were more plentiful, better paid, and often had better conditions. It's almost impossible to imagine in this 21st century multimedia world, but we do well to try. Imagine a world without colour. The lives of ordinary Britons, and many throughout Europe, had been blighted by a colourless reality ever since the Great Depression, which had begun in 1929. A decade later, the gloomy, multi-shaded life of grey was compounded with endless khaki. Visually, life must have appeared very depressing in much of Europe for 3 solid decades. The second event impacted ordinary people far less than it impacted the great of Britain. In November 1956, Prime Minister Anthony Eden sent British troops to invade Egypt. The goal was to regain control of the very lucrative Suez Canal. 2 days later, after heavy fighting and many casualties, British forces were withdrawn, despite having achieved virtually all their military objectives. A significant economic crisis followed in the wake of the invasion, and 2 short months later, Anthony Eden, now in poor health, had resigned as Prime Minister. Unfortunately, history shows that we British got exactly what we deserved. In Episode 1, we admired that great hero of war, General George C. Marshall. Post-war, as Secretary of State in the US, he also became a bastion of peace as he devised the extraordinarily ambitious plan to use American money to help rebuild Europe, and Great Britain especially. What became known as the Marshall Plan successfully channeled many billions of US dollars into Europe. Massive wartime lend-lease loans to Britain ensured our initial survival, but it was the Marshall Plan that enabled the process of rebuilding to begin. World War II saw Great Britain win through by the skin of its teeth, using primarily Churchill's blood, toil, tears and sweat. But whatever great remained in Britain was supported economically in war and peace entirely by the mighty American dollar. This would never have happened had energetic, visionary masterminds like George C. Marshall and other political leaders not striven so selflessly and diligently to help us. The entire British economy of the 1950s was supported by the generous compassion of Uncle Sam. God bless America, indeed. When Eden sent troops into Egypt, he did so without President Eisenhower's knowledge. Eden had, though, persuaded France to join Britain and, nefariously, cajoled Israel into the action too, all too easily using barefaced lies in the process. While President Eisenhower was happy enough to support the ailing British economy into recovery, he was certainly not going to spend hard-earned US dollars on our Middle Eastern war. He forced Eden into a humiliating withdrawal. Overnight, Britain had become less great. At exactly the same time as Britain's calamitous attempt to regain control of the Suez Canal, the Soviet Union sent tanks into Hungary to brutally crush the Hungarian uprising of 1956. Approximately 2,500 Hungarians were killed, and perhaps 250,000 became refugees. From this side of the pond, it's easy to look across to 1950s America and see utopia. As Britain and many in Europe struggled to survive, Americans seemed to be focused on the happy days of rock and roll. But America had struggles of its own, and one, the civil rights movement, was closely linked to rock and roll. In 1951, radio DJ Alan Freed began promoting rock and roll in Cleveland, Ohio. The shock was that he was energetically advertising this rock and roll music to the youth of both black and white America. Long before the civil rights movement began, there were courageous African American trailblazers riding their Harley-Davidsons. In the 1920s, William B. Johnson established the first African American Harley-Davidson dealership. For the next 60 years, he operated from his converted blacksmith shop in Somers, New York. William Johnson was also the first African American to gain a license and to compete in AMA motorcycle racing, although he had to pretend to be a Native American Indian to do it. In 1930, aged just 19, Bessie Stringfield became the first African American woman to ride solo right across America, which she did 7 more times apparently. Bessie Stringfield also served as a dispatch rider during World War II. In all, she'd owned 27 Harley-Davidsons, which, she said, were always blue and always new. She lived most of her long life in Miami, where she founded the Iron Horse Motorcycle Club. Later in the 1960s, African Americans Ben Hardy and Clifford Svors designed and built the legendary choppers in the 1969 film Easy Rider. Clifford Svors served in the Marine Corps before becoming a filmmaker. He was also very active in the civil rights movement and a long-standing member of the Chosen Few Motorcycle Club. It took 50 years before Ben Hardy and Clifford Svors received any official accreditation for their work, and a few years later in 2014, Peter Fonda wrote to Vors acknowledging something of the praise you deserve in designing the iconic bikes in Easy Rider. The Captain America chopper that Peter Fonda's character rode in the cult film was sold in 2014 for $1.3 million. This is the world into which the Harley-Davidson Sportster emerged. In Episode 1, we noted that Harley-Davidson launched the Model K in response to the British motorcycle invasion. It wasn't a very successful response. The Model K was heavy and sluggish with very old-fashioned technology, including side valve cylinders. I'm indebted to Brown Green here on YouTube, as he kindly pointed out that the humble Model K did have some overhead valve aspirations, something that I'd completely overlooked in the first video. Alan Girdler says that Harley had developed an experimental overhead valve Model K, designated the KL, but the KL design was more ambitious than just the overhead valves. It also sported a 60-degree configuration, where Harness had always been 45 degrees previously. It was very nearly an overhead camshaft too, or a sort of halfway house comparison anyway, which is more reminiscent of a car engine. It was even equipped with twin carburetors. In the end though, the aluminium alloy engine of the KL was dropped and the Ironhead engine for the Sportster XL was developed instead. The KL's aspirational aluminium design was fraught with problems, where the XL's cast iron cylinders and heads were considerably stronger and would be much quicker for Harley to develop and produce. Although the Harley-Davidson designers had been fully aware that the new, sportier Model K really needed more modern overhead valve technology, they were forced to abandon the plans, at least for the Model K. But imagine if they hadn't. Imagine that back in 1954, Harley-Davidson put the swish modern design overhead valve Model KL into production. That same year, the new Model KH gained a larger 54-inch or 888cc engine. That's a Sportster-size engine 3 years ahead of time. A 54-inch Model KL would have negated the need for a Sportster, which, therefore, would never have been produced. Would we be celebrating 70 years of the Model K right now, not 60 years of the Sportster? We'll never know. But as it says in Romans 8:28, all things really do work together for good, even motorbike things. Alan Girdler calls the Model Ks apprentice Sportsters. Consequently then, having served its 5-year apprenticeship, what marked a Sportster out from a mere Model K? What's the actual difference between the two? At first glance, not much. The 1956 Model KH and the 1957 Sportster XL even shared a virtually identical deluxe options package. This cost about $90 extra and consisted mainly of chrome and polished parts like the air cleaner and the petrol cap. Aficionados might point out that the 2-into-1 exhaust is slightly different on each model, or that the Sportster was equipped with 18-inch wheels and the Model K had 19-inch. They may even note that the Sportster's rear sprocket was riveted directly onto the drum brake. But who cares? These aren't significant, and certainly not enough to lord a Sportster over a Model K. But any petrolhead will tell you that the heart of every vehicle is the engine. If the XL engine is to be considered new, it's only Harley-Davidson new, that is, reworked and tweaked possibly with some new elements. As I noted in Episode 1, the Harley-Davidson Motor Company is much more focused on heritage than new, but in 1957 the motor company knew full well that the Sportster XL really needed some newness. Unfortunately, after the money and effort put into the abandoned KL, it was just not an option for their little engineering department to develop an entirely new engine. Therefore, the way forward was for Harley-Davidson to develop the old Model K flathead engine as far as it was physically possible to do so. and that inevitably meant overhead valves. These days the use of cast iron in an engine is laughable, but in the 1950s it was still relatively standard fare, and cast iron cylinders and heads were certainly the safest and easiest way to go. But, crucially, using strong, reliable and familiar cast iron meant that all Harley's engineering efforts could go into developing completely new cylinder heads rather than having to experiment with exotic aluminium alloys, and these traditional, rugged iron engines could comfortably encompass the all-important new overhead valve technology. Downstairs in the all-in-one unit XL engine, the gears and the drive gubbins were virtually identical to the Model K, but almost everything else had changed upstairs, the cylinder head and the barrels. Nowadays, computational fluid dynamics are used to calculate gas flows within the cylinder. If we use the most modern computer-aided design software, we can see that the old side valve engines had a necessarily bizarre, lopsided shape to the combustion chamber top. This was an inherently inefficient design, which Donnie Peterson calls inept. Because the valves are off to one side, all the gases have to be moved across the chamber before they can do anything. Overhead valves, on the other hand, utilize a much more regular hemispherical shape to the chamber, which allows the gases to enter and exit straight through the top. No hairpin turns. This is a much more efficient engine and, crucially, more powerful too, if somewhat disturbingly phallic. Changing the shape of the combustion chamber also allows a change in piston shape. Traditional side valve pistons were flat-topped, where the new XL pistons were roughly dome-shaped, which squashed the fuel-air mixture even harder. That is, it increased the compression ratio, creating yet more power. Fair you! But wait, there's even more! The original Model K had a 3.81-inch stroke, meaning that the pistons travelled up and down the cylinders that much. In 1954, the stroke was increased to 4.56 inches, which increased the cubic capacity from 750 to 888 cc. In other words, the piston now travelled a comparatively long way up and down. The new 1957 Sportster engine reverted to the original 3.81-inch stroke, but increased the bore size or cylinder diameter. The piston now had a relatively short trip up and down in relation to its width, which allowed the engine to rev higher, which also gave more power. A wider bore allowed for larger valves, which improved how the engine sucked in fuel and blew out exhaust, giving even more power. Peterson also calls the Model K's weighty brass carburetors inept. Where the Model K used the old Linkert M carburetor, the Sportster was equipped with the more modern, compact Linkert DC aluminium carburetor. Variations of both carburetors were used on many different Harley models. All this, with due difference to our American cousins, under-the-bonnet stuff is where the real changes and the positive differences were made. The apprentice bike, the Model K, was developed into a fully qualified Sportster XL and released into the world in the autumn of 1956. Until recently, the Harley-Davidson model year began in the autumn. Thus, the 1957 Sportster first appeared in late 1956. Launching a new model a few months before the new year allowed Harley-Davidson to accumulate sales before the calendar year began, often to the tune of several hundred units. In 1956, the grand total of new Harley-Davidson Sportsters sold was 1. In the first full production year of 1957, though, Sportster sales improved to a more reasonable, but in no way outstanding, 2,400 bikes. This compares with the best year for the Model K, which was its launch year of 1952, when nearly 2,000 bikes were sold, but sales dropped significantly after that. I've spent years wondering and discussing what it is that makes a Harley-Davidson Sportster distinctively a Sportster. Writing this video script made the answer to that question inescapable and surprisingly simple. Everything boils down to a straight comparison between the classic Model K and the ubiquitous Sportster XL, and really, there's only one tangible difference: the engine. Back when the world first got to see the Sportster XL, Eager buyers would, obviously, be comparing the new XL with the last of the Model Ks, and they, like us, would see no significant stylistic differences. As they read the new advertisements, they'd look right past the easy ride hydraulic front fork and the swing arm suspension, saying, "That's just the same as the old bike." The only difference they'd notice was the engine. Overhead valve power. With hindsight, it's easy to see that the stuff of legends was emerging. However, as the rather average sales figures of 1957 show, the Sportster was certainly not legendary yet. In episode 3, we're going to see precisely how and when the Harley-Davidson Sportster actually became the greatest motorcycle in the world. When the Model K was released in 1952, Britain lost King George VI to cancer, and his daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, ascended the throne. Now we've lost, arguably, the greatest monarch this country has ever known. When I was born, Elizabeth had already been Queen for over a decade, and next Monday she'll be laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. I believe all of Great Britain will miss her. God save King Charles III.